I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
Today is a conversation that Lee and I had talked about having last term.
It's a conversation we've been having for a while.
Yeah, it's a conversation we've been having for quite a while. We'll ground our biases here in a second. Now everybody knows where we're coming from. But we spent quite a bit of time over the last few months reading and talking about Huaban xiaoshuo, or vernacular fiction.
And we put some of those up.
Yeah, there's a couple of those up on the website. It's a very interesting genre of writing in the Ming-Qing dynasty, late 17th, early 18th century. But it raises an interesting question because it's extremely vernacular.
Very.
And one of the sort of abiding...
myths?
Not really, I was going to say myth, but it's really...
myth in the, not necessarily...
the untrue way, but the sort of a structuring narrative of modern Chinese literature, in mainland China anyway, is that modern Chinese colloquial literature starts in 1919.
Mm-hmm.
That's
May 4th movement.
May 4th movement, that is it.
Everything begins with the May 4th movement.
And yet, then it's confusing because when we read Huaban, we say, but wait, this is really colloquial. I mean, it's grimy details,
it's
it's ordinary people. Yeah, it's really very vernacular.
In some ways, I would argue that it's maybe in some ways more vernacular in the sense that it's more readable than a lot of May 4th literature. Or, I mean, the greats like Lu Xun, I think that you can't say that for that, but a lot of the stuff that comes after Lu Xun is quite difficult to read. And this is much, much easier. Some of the vocabulary is more obscure and some of the phrases, you kind of have trouble figuring out, but it's pretty dang readable.
It is. And so to sort of ground the discussion a little bit, and by the way, we don't have really a plan for this. This is more just a freewheeling discussion.
We're just drunken men wandering through the woods.
Exactly. We don't even know what we're doing. Of course, do we ever? But we'll ground our biases here a little bit because I'm partial to the modern Chinese literature begins in 1919. Even though I know that's not exactly the case, it's a fun story. Because I lived in mainland China for 10 years. And when I started studying literature, my first thing that I read in modern Chinese was Lu Xun's The True Story of A-Q. That was sort of my thing that I read. And I loved Lu Xun, and I loved a lot of the May 4th writers. And so I'm sort of sentimentally attached to this idea.
On the other hand, I started out studying Chinese literature. The first time I read Chinese literature was at Brigham Young University. I read, I think, the introduction to Lu Xun's Nahan with a professor from Nanjing University. So I had that kind of beginning, but I did go in a different direction. As the listener to the podcast knows, I am more Taiwanese oriented now. And I don't think that necessarily, I don't want to suggest that Taiwan is any less involved in this myth making or in this narrative of the May 4th movement. It is, well, actually it is. It is much less prominent there in literary circles, but it still certainly exists. But I like Lu Xun in some ways. When he's great, I think he's great. But I also think that later writers like Zhang Ailing, who I think is the best writer in the 20th century Chinese literature, I think that she is drawing more on this language of Huaban, this language of Ming-Qing literature. Sorry, we've got a dog barking above us.
No, that's somebody sneezing. We'll leave that, and that'll be fun color for the listener.
But I think that one of the things that makes Zhang Ailing so popular is that she is drawing off of this Ming-Qing vernacular literature, and she's sort of in a very, I think, political move, rejecting the politicization of the May 4th movement. And she and I guess to defend my position, because anybody who knows anything about Chinese literature will say, well, Lu Xun's obviously the greatest writer of the 20th century in China. I guess to defend my position, I would say very few people, a much smaller number of people read Lu Xun for pleasure than do read Zhang Ailing. And the way that I judge literature is not only, but I think that kind of ability to stand over a long time is very important. And so drawing off of these Ming Qing vernacular kinds of stories, not just Huaben, but she's also drawing off of the Xiaoshuo of that period. Drawing off of those things is something that just readers like a lot more. And so that gives her a certain claim to greatness that I think Lu Xun just is maybe harder to.
Of course, I would argue, though, that if we're going to go that route, well, we have to be careful going that route because that takes us right into, well, what is literature really?
Right. Is it just
because one of the things that strikes me about Huaben is it's genre fiction. And
could you define genre fiction? I'm always unclear on what genre.
With genre fiction, in this case, it operates according to a certain set of tropes, principles, and the effectiveness of the story is based on how well it employs them. So we talk about like modern fantasy, right? You basically, any story you read that's called fantasy is going to have at least some basic things in common.
So let me make sure I'm getting this right. So like if we were to talk about Western literature, a Western novel, you would have a cowboy necessarily. You would maybe have Indians. You would have certain other tropes.
Right.
And so Huaben is that same kind. It's a different genre, obviously.
Well, like in a lot of our discussions, for example, we've mentioned the way a certain story plays off of the idea of containment.
Right.
Right.
And a woman has to be contained.
Right.
If she comes out of containment, that's when the story starts. That's when the problem
starts. If she opens a window and she's told not to, you know what's going to happen next. And in that sense, that's one of the reasons why a lot of modern critics, a lot of modern scholars have a difficult time locating any sense of interiority in the characters. Because to some extent, that's not germane to the story. Any more than if you have, say, Lord of the Rings, do you really care what about Gandalf's childhood? I mean, no one really does. He's the wizard. He doesn't really need much of an interiority to be a really interesting character.
And therefore, we don't know what he's thinking. That's what you mean.
And even if you do, it's employed in such a way that it's there to sort of advance the plot. It's not there to explore who Gandalf is.
It's oftentimes just him saying whatever.
Right. And so where I burned out on some of those Huaben stories is precisely this. Like, it's interesting, but with a certain number of stories, you begin to see, okay, so here's the containment trope again that's being broken. Probably she's going to get in trouble. Yep, there she is. She's in trouble. Which doesn't make them any more than really good fantasy is less good based on the tropes. These aren't any less good. It's just, when I think of literature, this is my own personal bias.
This podcast is only for your personal biases.
That's it. It exists.
It's a vehicle for your personal biases.
We should put that up on the tagline for the thing. About us. This podcast exists to communicate Rob's personal bias.
Sorry, go on.
No. There has to be, for me, some sense of...
what is literature? That's what you're talking
about. Yeah. Jeez. There's no way I'm wading into that. That's going to take way too long.
No, go for it.
No, but what I was going to say is, like, for example, when I think about May 4th literature, for example, there's a self-conscious desire to explore what's happening inside a character. Now, to some extent, of course, that's always going to be synthetic. You can't know everything that's going to go on in a person, right? I mean, that's where I burned out reading The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. For as wonderfully written as it is, at some point you're like, A, I really don't care about this much of the inside of a person. And B, really what you're writing about is just you. Right. Because not all people think like this. But anyway, what's interesting, though, is that with the May 4th movement, and Lee's right, these novels aren't all bestsellers. They don't, top the charts the way, say, Li Yu would have.
Right. Li Yu.
Yeah, we have a couple of podcasts up about him from the Ming Qing era. These aren't commercial writers, so to some extent, they're not read as much. But there's a self-conscious desire, especially on the part of Lu Xun, to give life to the interior part of a character who no one would have cared about otherwise. And the desire to explore that means you really have to create new ways of writing, especially if there's not much of an established tradition of doing that.
Can I ask you, though? I mean, you're talking about interiority, but and I agree with you. There is definitely an interiority that's there in the May 4th characters from May 4th literature that is kind of lacking in a lot of the Huaben that we read, and I think is pretty much lacking in most of Mingjing literature, but how much of that is a function of language, and how much of that is a function of these, the May 4th is obsessed, or is very, I shouldn't say obsessed, but taken with ideas of psychology that are very much kind of coming from the West at that very moment, that Westerners themselves are thinking about at the time, at the sort of turn of the century, post World War I.
No, I think that's right on. I mean, I think there's a larger discussion happening. I mean, Lu Xun, before he writes a single thing in quote unquote modern style, he spends time studying in Japan. He has translated Victor Hugo into Chinese. Well,
he didn't read French, right?
No, he didn't read French.
He read Russian and Japanese. He was translating it.
I believe so. Yeah, I think he probably would have been using a Japanese edition, but. So he's been exposed to these new ideas. This is not a domestic product necessarily, but for me, it doesn't have to be.
I'm not saying that it needs to be. What I am saying is, like, just on a purely linguistic level, do you think that... Do you see my problem with a lot of the May 4th language? Does that make sense? Like, I think that so there are fart jokes in Mingqing literature, which I think are fantastic.
Yeah, they are.
But beyond just fart jokes, there's something, the May 4th movement is trying to trying to make language. One of the things that they are actively and consciously doing is they're rejecting classical Chinese models. They're saying, no, we're not going to study in classical Chinese and Wenyan Wen. We're going to study in vernacular. And they're embracing this difference and this change, and they're kind of reveling in this change. But I think that oftentimes they come up with a language that is just as obscure as, or more obscure than Wenyan Wen, classical Chinese. It's kind of just hard to read. It's hard for anybody who's not trained in reading May 4th movement literature to read that stuff. And that's where I think that...
I would be curious, though, to hear examples about that, because my experience... Are you talking about difficulty with people at the time reading it, or now?
At the time.
Okay, at the time, possibly, yeah.
And just like, I mean, they're trying to awake the Chinese nation, but... the Chinese nation, most people are not reading that. Most people are reading stuff like
But again,
Mingqing literature.
One of the concerns is not that this generation right now, everyone has to be able to read this. One of the concerns was to create a new form of literature in China and sort of leave that to its own devices, assuming that at some point people will need to read this. And in that sense, when I read someone like Lu Xun, possibly someone a little more populist like Lao She, who writes Tea House, which if you've ever read it or listened to it is very much like a tea house. Yeah. Is a little bit like Molière was to the French, in the sense that Molière produced plays and things that really weren't considered literature or art, but certainly are now. And in the same way...
Time has made it literature? It's gone from being...
Well, nothing is literature all by itself. It requires a structuring narrative. I mean, the idea that we should study Huaben, which is essentially pulp fiction from the Mingqing era.
It's very much pulp.
I mean, if I suggested, we should really dedicate our academic careers to studying detective fiction, you'd be like...
or comic books.
There are people who do that.
No, we have one of the best scholars here at the University of Oregon, Michael Allen, if I do say so myself, studies comic books. He's amazing. But it's very difficult to make that argument, or to get you can make the argument, but to get people to respect it and to fund it.
And I'll put this out there too, because this is a part of my personal bias, is my own personal experience with these texts. I read Huaben in the context of United States academia, and it's interesting from a historical perspective, from the development of literary genres in China, that perspective. I don't find it stimulating. It's fun, it's funny, it's interesting, but I don't read it and put it down and go, wow, I really want to think about this.
So you get that from Lu Xun.
The first time I read Lu Xun, I'd already been in China for about 5 years. And so I had interacted with a lot of different people, including a ton of farmers, cab drivers, sort of ordinary people. And the way this character of AQ was presented was striking because I'd met people exactly like this. He talked like the cab drivers I'd met.
I think I've heard that Lu Xun, when he after he wrote AQ, he kept running into people who said, "Why did you base that character on me? Why did you base that character on me? It's so much like me. You had to be writing about me." He kept saying, like I didn't write about anyone. It was just I was writing about everything.
Exactly, but that's part of what I find so fascinating is that in Huaben literature, for as much as I like reading it, at no point am I really struck by what I'm reading, sort of even an emotional level.
But let me push back against that, because it almost seems like you're suggesting that literature should be some sort of sociological, anthropological project, where you're like using the literature to dissect.
I don't mean dissect. I wouldn't say dissect. I know I can see your point there. It's less that it's dissection, because that was Balzac's project in the 19th century. Was let's present the typology of all people everywhere. That was the human comedy.
Really, that's very ballsy.
I know, right?
Him.
Lee Moore with the original pun. Thank you. No one's ever made that one before.
No.
We could make worse with his name. I just anyway. We won't go there.
I thought that was a pretty clean pun for a
it was. I was very
Balzac
impressed
joke.
that you restrained yourself so well for our listeners. There's way worse things you could have said.
I've heard the listener has read much worse things in his Huaben.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we probably said worse in the podcast about the Huaben. No, but for me, in my own personal approach to literature, there has to be something that moves me beyond the confines of the story itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I really enjoy reading science fiction, for example. But when I finish a science fiction novel, I put it down and I go, man, that was good. But at no point do I feel like I'm sort of reconsidering myself or the world around me or anything. It's just really good, right?
So I guess this is where a lot of our disagreements come from. Because for me, it has to be about the language. The language has to be fantastic.
Aesthetically pleasing.
Aesthetically pleasing. And that's number one.
Interesting. And you found the Huaben language artistically pleasing.
I don't know if I would go that far. My Chinese is not good enough to distinguish between, like, Lolita and Nabokov and just kind of, like, something far below that as far as, like, linguistic registers. But I find oftentimes, and Lu Xun is oftentimes not this way, but a lot of May 4th fiction is stultifying. It just kind of like, it makes birds fall out of the sky. It's so boring.
I definitely don't see that. But
not in Lu Xun.
Well, it's a huge body of work too. So, and you're right that when you get someone like, Mao Dun, who's just horrifyingly boring. I get that. But in any given movement,
and I'm not even talking about people like Lei Feng, because he's not even in the right period. But that kind of communist claptrap language,
which is fascinating in an entirely different way.
But it's fascinating from a sociological perspective. Yeah. You would not read it for fun.
I would never assign Lei Feng and go, "This is beautiful literature." Wait to. I see what you're saying, and to a certain extent, I agree, because my favorite pieces of literature typically are aesthetically pleasing, but I would argue that Lu Xun at least does qualify for that in places. Like, we haven't yet talked about, for example, Wild Grass, but that's a stunning piece of writing.
I think so, yeah. But let me just point something out.
Yes.
Not only has the podcast not talked about Wild Grass, most people in China never hear about or read Wild Grass. It's kind of ignored in China.
It is and it is not. They're the first.
I've never seen it in any anthology.
The first short essay is studied in most schools in China. Yes, because every person I've met in China knows the first line of that book. Everybody, which is funny because the rest of the book is
much better,
very hard to read, and is very interesting. I gave an English translation copy to an Australian friend of mine, a much older person who's been in academia a while, and she never read it. She gave it back. She said, "Wow. I thought somebody like Camus had created existentialist literature, but apparently not."
So Wild Grass, I agree that's an incredible work of fiction, but it's not really read as much in China as the other things from Nahan.
Most people know the first line of that piece. But again, see, one of the things we get into is the idea that the sort of the old dichotomy between popular and quote-unquote real literature.
Mm.
That is not literature unless it's hard to read, or vice versa, the populists who are like, unless it's, widely read, we shouldn't even consider it. So the fact that the May 4th writers are not sort of read all over China just by regular people, for me, doesn't at all disqualify any of it as literature.
I don't think it disqualifies it, but I think it makes me suspicious.
Why?
Because I think that a lot of times people have bad writing. A lot of times people write bad things. People write things badly. And they say, as their excuse for no one reading it, that, oh, you just don't understand. I'm so far advanced beyond my time, yada, yada, yada.
Of course, the same is equally true for very good writing. Like, this is the trick, is...
I don't know if it's generally not true for... there is some good writing that does that, but I think most good writing is recognized in its time. I mean, there are exceptions like Moby Dick, which was completely ignored, but a lot of really good writing, I mean, if you think about Lolita, you think about Joyce's Ulysses...
The trick, and here's where I would jump in on this, though, is that to some extent true. However, in all of those cases, those books are coming within essentially an established tradition of a certain kind of writing. Like Flaubert's Madame Bovary, for example, brings in free and direct discourse for the first time, and it's shocking, but it's responding to something that's not a drastic departure, really. It's a different way of narrating the interiority of a character, but it's not like you're just starting something from scratch. And with the May 4th movement, you have a self-conscious engagement with, I'm going to use the term non-Chinese because, I think it's fairly qualified, non-Chinese literary forms and styles.
But I guess the question is really like, I mean, the May 4th movement always says we're doing something different linguistically on all kinds of levels, not just linguistically, but on all kinds of ways. And I don't know that they actually do things that differently. Like, one of their claims is that one of the claims that's made in China now is that 1919 is the first time vernacular literature comes into China. And I think...
Well, it's a little bit of a reduction. But
just barely. Like, that's the way it was presented to me. And people will say, well, there was some stuff before, but it wasn't really that important or something like that. But there's this actually a huge body of literature in vernacular before 1919 that they just kind of ignored completely. And I think this is an argument that David Wong makes. Do you remember the...
Repressed modernity.
Repressed modernity, thank you. So David Wong makes this argument sort of in Repressed Modernity that, in fact, the late Qing was the site of this kind of modern this modern thing happening in China, and 1919 comes around and they just kind of forget all of that. I guess I would make the argument that push David Wong back a little bit further and say, like, hey, this is actually, vernacular exists, modernity exists in this long sort of trajectory. It's not a break that occurs in 1919. It's not just something that comes out of nowhere.
The difference there for me would be, if we're talking about modernity linguistically, I can go with you a certain extent there. But if we're talking about modernity from the perspective of a particular dialogue that's taking place, the May 4th is really... The late Qing people begin engaging with foreign literature critically, really, for the first time. What's interesting, though, is I think the dominant mode of expression in late Qing is translation. So forms are being brought in and transmitted, but in terms of original creations, that's not what the late Qing is really known for. There are original creations, and they're weird and interesting, but they're very early salvos, and my sort of amateurish argument is I'm not entirely sure those forms have been studied or understood yet.
In the late Qing?
In the late Qing. This is why you get something like 新石头记, the new story of the stone, which is quote-unquote science fiction.
Which is fantastic.
Which is amazing.
We need to do that podcast.
We do. It's amazing in the sort of B-movie amazing way. You're like, I can't believe someone actually did this.
I really want to do an MST3K of the movie that is made out of Shitoji.
But
I can be the robot.
It is. I forgot that, yeah. I would be Crow. Anyway, but the May 4th writers, I think, have a firmer grasp, possibly because of all the translations from the late Qing, of the literary dialogue happening
outside
in Europe, outside of China.
So,
and they are inserting themselves into this dialogue by presenting Chinese people in a specific way that I really don't have seen before.
I 100% agree with that point. I think that... I don't know. Tell me if you think this is totally off.
Totally off. Yeah.
Thank you. So the thing that makes the May 4th different is not that they're writing in vernacular. It's that they're writing with a consciousness of this Euro-American outside world and the discourse. They have some connection with that discourse that's going on in outside of China, whereas anybody before them is not writing with any knowledge of that discourse.
I have a question, though.
Hang on. Do you feel that's right?
I think the question ties into that.
Okay, go for it.
So, just a very basic point. When I pick up Lu Xun, it's in a modern grammar that's very similar to what you would read even in journals today. Not identical, but it's very, very similar. Huabun is recognizably an older literary style. You still have some of the 4-character phrases happening.
But you still have that in modern Chinese.
To some extent, but that's being gotten rid of consciously by the May 4th. Even in the late Qing, you can't read, for example, late Qing literature unless you've studied some classical. It's not classical, but it's still so heavily influenced by it that it's very hard to read.
But everybody in the May 4th has studied classical.
They have, but their writings are not that way. Like someone born 100 years later, me, for example, I can read A-Q. It's not easy, but I can read A-Q.
But you can read Ming Qing fiction.
Not without any knowledge of classical, no. There's still so much grammar in the Ming Qing that has it has elements of classical in there that are very important that you can't read without it.
I don't feel like it's that much more than reading a current Chinese novel.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Because I can read current Chinese novels, but I slogged through most of those Huabun.
I don't know. It doesn't feel that different for me.
That's really strange.
I don't know. We'll ask the listener to comment.
Yeah. We'll give you a couple of minutes. No. So yeah, that was sort of my question is, to what extent though were the Huabun were these things that were being read by farmers, or were they being read by the literati still? And it was just sort of like Pulp Fiction, but
I don't know. I'm not someone who does Ming Qing literature, but my understanding is farmers aren't being taught to read.
Right.
I think that the Huabun are for not necessarily the elite of the elite,
right?
But
maybe
take a step down.
Class.
Yeah, I think there is an emerging middle class of traders and people who do business, and a lot of the Huabun are very concerned with business transactions.
That's true.
And so maybe at the very least, I don't know if that's necessarily the audience, but I would suggest that it's thinking about those issues of transactions and sort of proto-capitalism in late imperial China.
I think my final word on the vernacular versus not vernacular thing in the May 4th would be that they read noticeably differently than the Huabun. I mean, if you put them on a page, the register is very different. Whether one is vernacular and the other is not, I honestly don't think my Chinese is good enough to comment. But they are distinctly different in the way they're executed. So I can't go so far as to say that the May 4th is just continuing that tradition, because there is a break. Having done enough study of late Qing translation and fiction, Lu Xun's True Story of A.Q. is a completely different animal than, say, Wang Guowei's essay on, Hong Romang. Very, very different.
Though they're very different types of writing.
They are. But, I mean, even a piece of fiction like Xin Shi Touji still has some elements of classical grammar. I feel like far more than Lu Xun and people after him.
But IQ still has elements of classical.
A few, but I would say not nearly as many as the late Qin.
Okay.
That's me.
Okay. I guess for my final word, I think we're arguing about more than linguistics.
I would agree.
There's something bigger here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'm really glad we had this discussion.
Me too.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I think on that note, we'll just call it quits.
All right.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.